to talk about entering a nonprofit organization. And the first thing that you need to do when entering an organization is to actually understand some of the forces that folks are dealing with. Forces at work in the nonprofit sector, these are all going to sound really, really familiar to you. But one of the things that we'd just like to heighten your awareness of, or just enrich our dialogue with a better understanding, is these guys are under a lot of pressure. It's extremely difficult to navigate the nonprofit sector. There is a new demand from donors for greater accountability, yet a lack of data internally to respond to that need. There is greater wealth supposedly out there, but quite often they're also seeing a proliferation of nonprofits, so the wealth isn't transferring into the coffers of the individual nonprofit. We've also got this recent downturn, and I think the numbers this year are going to be devastating for a lot of nonprofit organizations, and I'm sure some of you are already feeling that crunch with the nonprofits you work with. You're seeing a move in terms of changes in traditional funding, decreased government funding, performance-based contracts all over. Focus on performance. If I'd done this presentation a year ago with the advent of Charitable Way and Helping.org, et cetera, that pressure in terms of internet and donors would have been at a high. I would actually say that over the past year, we've seen all of those organizations crash, or not all, but I would say in the neighborhood of 80 to 90%. Therefore, there's a little bit less pressure, but I think the underlying focus on, my dollar's important and why should it go to you has been sustained throughout the year. In addition, new competition, we talked about social enterprise. You can think about it within the organization, but a bunch of these organizations are feeling it externally. For-profit competitors are coming into traditional service spaces, be it meals for the homeless, beds for drug addicts, all across United Way feeling extreme pressure, all across the nonprofit sector. So basically, folks are having a tough time getting and retaining talent, although I'd say that has shifted in the last 6 months. If my calendar being booked with folks wanting to talk about the nonprofit sector is representative of that, I think we're seeing an inflow. But really dependence on funders with increased performance pressure, limited access to capital markets, and lack of systems to make a lot of this stuff happen. When we talk to nonprofit managers about what they're feeling pressure about, despite the criticism that they don't care about measuring performance, this first one tends to be fairly high on the top of the list. How do I measure the impact of my work? Even if it's only within the organization, how do I know that X program is serving kids better than Y program? How do I think about that? And once again, problems having the data for that. The impact of venture philanthropy, replication of programs. How do we use the internet to build this donor base? Is it the panacea, or is it something that's just not worth my time? How do I get talent, and how do I keep that talent? Should we merge with other nonprofits? How do I structure my relationship with the foundation? How do we compete with for-profits? And the board question is paramount in many nonprofits. So these are some of the issues that are articulated to us. When you're entering a nonprofit organization, quite often they will start with one of these questions, but you really need to get back to basics in terms of mission creep, right? Quite often, somebody will identify, well, I'm having a trouble with my board. What really is happening is the board doesn't understand your strategy and thinks it's off base, and therefore you've got to go back to mission and strategy. I can count on one hand the number of engagements I've done where we don't have to get back to basics and say, okay, what's the mission? Does everybody agree with it? Is the strategy in place? So even if it's an intervention about my costs are off, if you go back and ask, why 7 times as you would at Toyota, it quite often happens to go right back to mission and strategy. Key differences between nonprofits and for-profits. They're quite clear. We know them, but when you come down to really dealing with them on a day-to-day basis, it's hard. To solve a social problem, this is what leads to mission creep. Any program that you do for kids is going to be helpful. It gets kids involved, it gets them pumped up. What is too many programs? How do I evaluate the various efficacy? There is no return for shareholders. There's no ROIC that we can talk about in this dimension. Measurement, clear bottom line metrics versus Qualitative, output-oriented. I served 250 kids. How do I know if I did it well? Governance, multiple influences. Quite often you'll work with a nonprofit and the most important and powerful people are the volunteers, right? So you'll do this fabulous project for the executive director. You might even get the board's buy-in. You think you've got it all lined up, and a very powerful volunteer or donor shoots it out of the water. So really needing to circle the wagons with all the different constituencies. Fragmented project-focused funding, clearly defined and accessible capital markets, conversely in the for-profit market. HR, often a voluntary or missionary workforce that does it all. And it is very hard to ask somebody who feels that they are giving up their life for this cause, with all of the passion and energy around that, to fill out a stupid form. It doesn't make them happy. Versus for-profit, you don't pay them or you fire them. It's easier. And quite often our work in the for-profit realm, we go in, we sit down with the CEO. He or she says, you got it, this is our project plan, go make it happen. We make it happen. And if somebody doesn't agree down the line, we've got the backing of the CEO. That's a lot of power. In a nonprofit, harder to navigate. You got to, once again, circle those wagons. Stakeholders, multiple constituencies, once again, versus just customers and shareholders. And then role of competition being unclear. I am very nervous even saying the C word when I meet with nonprofits. It's like, don't say the C word. Competition. It makes boards and staff extremely nervous at first juncture. And quite often the C word that they want to hear is collaboration, right? So you've got to work that angle. What's competition? What's collaboration? How consultants and nonprofits sometimes see each other. I use this slide with our engagement managers. Corporate raiders in blue suits. We are intimidating. We are uptight. We are not fun. Bain might be fun. McKinsey, not fun. We show up. We're whippersnappers. We're so smart. We've done our 5 forces analysis. We can draw a cost curve so fast it'll make your head spin. That's great. It's intimidating. It's foreign. You're part of the system, right? Very, very difficult to get through that. There's also this perception. Well, if you go into the nonprofit sector, you couldn't cut it in the for-profit sector. They're like all the people over in Berkeley, right? Saving the world. Okay? There is stereotypes on both sides that are quite frustrating. Now, the bottom line is there are very smart, very talented people in the nonprofit sector. And the bottom line is all of the consultants who do this kind of work really care and really want to make a difference. But this perception is real as well. The underlying isn't real, but the perception is. We don't wear suits. No. And actually, we do address that. So we work very hard to address this issue.
I dressed up for you today. Being a humble East Coast Harvard boy, I was sort of awed, by. And I said, but I knew you had a golf course, so I put on this golf tie. Another corporate symbol not well accepted in the nonprofit world.
Yeah.
The idea of playing golf. Yeah.
And Seth and I were harassing each other about suits. The only reason I'm wearing a suit is I have not lost the 15 pounds from having a baby. So until those pounds are lost, I'm not standing in front of 100 people without, a little coverage.
I'm going to save Maisie from saying anything more about that. But it's a great point. And in fact, we did a workshop with all of the Bridgespan staff about this whole issue of, what do people expect of you? And if you took the average cross-section of the Bridgespan staff in Boston, you would have this sort of well-educated, Ivy League, well-scrubbed, predominantly white group of people going, let's say, to talk to people at the Harlem Children's Zone about their problem, where nobody is white, nobody went to the Harvard Business School, all that sort of stuff. And so the reality is, and that's what Maisie's about the comment, is that it's it starts with a mindset. It starts with a consciousness of all the things that you've said. I created a little role play example for that workshop in Bridgespan, which you can just think about. I don't have to put you through the role play. I can save you a whole 30 minutes. And just think about the fact that people who come from, all of you who do this work as a volunteer, do it, probably in schedules that are, tightly scheduled. You got to go. You want to get stuff done and so on. And you show up, and just as Maisie said, they've got something else going on. They've got somebody who quit. They've got a volunteer who didn't show up. That whatever it is that's going on, they may even think they've solved the problem because they knew you were coming, and they want to share with you that. And people from our backgrounds are real eager to get in and help. And sometimes the best help you can be is to let them talk. Let them share with you what it is that's on their mind. They'll reveal a ton. And one of the best things you could do maybe in your second meeting is play back to them some of what they heard and say, is this what's going on here? Is this what's happening with the strategy? You might hear the mission creep in that first meeting, and instead of saying, oh, good, I heard about mission creep, I'm here to solve it for you. Here, I can, I got my toolkit because I went to this, this thing on the 20th down at Stanford. That is really important. I mean, these perceptions are not only real, but the fact is you've got to fundamentally think about not just those stereotypes, but just the culture you are in. A lot of the comments people made, think if you were in the other shoes, what that person wants to do with you when you show up. They might say, oh, my God, someone's here. You can answer the phone for 5 minutes. I had a good friend who showed up at a community center as a volunteer in Sonoma County. And he went to this place because they serve the Latino population, and he speaks Spanish. And they said, can you help a few people fill out job applications this morning? Someone came in late. He thought he was going to do strategy, and he had his MBA. He'd worked in financial services. He'd worked on Wall Street. He was going to help them raise money. He was going to do all sorts of stuff. The fact is, what they needed that day was someone to help a few non-English speaking people fill out their job applications. He did some real work. The fact is, he didn't necessarily move the organization forward. So at some point, you've got to get out of that mode, and you actually do have to start the dialogue about the serious issues. But just being sensitive to the fact you might not be as bloody efficient as when you show up at, Oracle or Bank of America or somewhere else.
An understanding of your strengths and weaknesses, I think, is critical. And, we do this as an organization. I would do it as a person. I would sit down and say, what am I good at? What am I bad at? What baggage am I bringing to the table? So to Abigail's point, I'm not going to show up in a blue suit. I'm going to understand the context. To Seth's point, I'm going to think about listening. I'm going to think about maybe doing some work as a volunteer to understand it. I think getting in the trenches is a terrific way of building trust early on. I think as an organization for McKinsey, right, then this is the lens I take, we have more of an understanding of the client culture because we are a for-profit, data-driven, rigorous, up or out, uptight corporate culture. This is taped, and I said uptight. That's bad. So I think, there's more of an understanding of the context for an individual client. There's more of an understanding of how things run. And sector-specific knowledge, generally we've done our research. We know the different sectors. Now we've done our research for nonprofits, so we actually are pretty equal on that. And then insufficient implementation support or follow-up. This is actually a fascinating point for me. If you think about a nonprofit engagement for us, if you draw a brontosaurus, that's how I think about it. There's a ton of work we need to put into negotiation up front. Problem definition and scoping is absolutely critical. And then we put a lot of work and time and energy into the actual engagement. And then the tail of the brontosaurus, we need to think really critically about how we follow up. Is it a board seat? Is it monthly meetings? Is it an ongoing project? And that is much more critical, I found, in the for-profit, in the nonprofit, rather, arena. Final way we think about entering nonprofit organizations, we've covered a lot of this, which is terrific. But when we are doing the pre-study work, the conversations, sometimes these conversations can be, 4 conversations, really hammering out what's going on with the organization, a day in the trenches, getting a sense of the organization. asking why something's not working, interviewing board members, interviewing volunteers. Now, that being said, if you are a lone consultant, an individual approaching an organization, it may feel a little bit unwieldy to say, oh, I want to interview all of your board members and your volunteers and so on and so forth if you're only working on a project that's a component of a nonprofit versus an overall strategic haul. But still, stop people in the hallways, talk to them about what's going on in the context, and be as aggressive as you can about getting on the executive director's calendar to understand the context of what you're trying to do and whether or not that would be useful for the organization. Because what will be frustrating to you as an individual consultant is if you come up with a fabulous plan for a program that doesn't fit into the overall strategic context.
And I think you're all likely to be working on projects that may be very small teams or very large teams, and I think you have to gauge it. There are some of the things we'll talk about tonight, I think, a single person, can do. You could say, okay, I don't have a lot of time to interview every board member, but since we're doing, maybe they have a strategic planning committee, maybe they have a new ventures committee, maybe they have, finance committee or something that's relevant to the topic you're working on, go meet with that board member. Get what you can of those insights so that you're educated. One example came up today at work. There's an organization that's approached us about doing a project at a zoo. And it's out of town, and I was looking at sort of flight schedule, and I was talking to the sort of administrator who's sort of setting up my visit, and they said, well, you'll get in, you'll have this hour to kill before the executive director is ready to see you. I said, well, can I get a tour of the zoo? I mean, can I look around? I'll see, will there be membership applications? Will there be, what will I learn about the zoo? Again, back to the point, I've never had a zoo as a client before, okay? I've been to zoos. I got 2 little kids. I love zoos. But what will I pick up from just an hour walking around before that? And Maisie's point about whether you've volunteered there or whether you do there, just checking out some of what they do so that you're a little more informed. And not for the purpose of, as I said before, not for the purpose of showing off, saying, oh, yeah, I've visited your zoo, 3 or 4 times. It's not for that purpose. It's just so that you might ask the question of, I saw a membership brochure. Do you have a lot of members of the zoo? Are they donors? Are some of these big donors? What do they get with their membership? And has that been a successful thing? And do you use direct mail? And you might have a whole set of questions just because you saw a little membership application on your way in. I'm going to shift gears for a second, and I'm going to ask Laura and Peggy to pass out a sheet. I brought along one handout, a one-page handout. There's some other handouts to pick up outside later we'll talk about. But this is the simplest construct that I could come up with to think about once you are engaging in this dialogue with the client, what is it you're trying to do? And this is, when you get this piece of paper, what you'll notice, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a transparency of it. That was the last thing I was supposed to do before I left the office and forgot. I was busy tying my tie. But there's 5 boxes on there, and what they basically say is that an aligned strategy has a number of components. As you look at the sheet, it says you've got to know what your desired outcome is. You've got to know what your theory of change is. You have to sort of look at the focus of your programs, what implications that has for your operation, and what metrics you have. And there's a kind of arrow at the bottom of the page. I'm not going to take you through all of these in great detail. This is a useful checklist approach that we've used with clients to just sort of say, look, you might have come to us, you might have a very clearly defined mission, you may have very clearly articulated what outcome you're looking for, but you want to talk about a particular program. And really, digging in kind of in the middle column, you'll find yourself one way or another being effective at some point covering all 5 boxes. An effective strategy will touch all 5 boxes. Your project might only touch one of them. To us, the most important box on here, the most important thing that's becoming for us. And remember, Bridgespan's been around only about 3 years. So 3 years of experience, if you asked us to summarize, what have we observed? What have we observed that is most consistent in high-performing nonprofits and what's not there in low-performing? It's that they have not taken the time to truly articulate what is the outcome they're trying to achieve and how is that outcome achieved in society, the sort of theory of change. Now, those sound like buzzwords, but your intended impact or your desired outcome and the theory of change, we spent a lot of time on. So if I were to translate that to what may be, in your case, a volunteer project done in a much smaller number of hours than a Bridgespan project, would be I would ask those questions. I would ask it of the people, of the board members. I would try to see if there really is a consensus on what is it you really want to be held accountable for. And the way we think about this is different from a mission. Missions always sound very lofty. Stanford probably has a mission like, educate people and, make them good citizens of the world. Or something. Somewhere there's probably something written that sounds very lofty. It's great. But a desired outcome often sounds more like something that you can put time and definition around. If you listen to it, you'd really know who the beneficiary was. Let's take my organization that was trying to get older Americans into the workforce. Their desired outcome was that the next generation of older Americans choose, to a much greater extent than this generation, choose public service of some sort, public or social service of some sort, as part of their retirement or part of their later stage of life. That the outcome they wanted was that by the time a generation has gone by, it would be far more commonplace. It would be expected when you retired that someone would say, where are you going to travel to? Someone might say, where are you going to volunteer? Or where are you going to serve? Or where are you going to work part-time to do something good for society? So they're picturing literally a generational shift when they think of their outcome. There could be an outcome that says, I'm a nonprofit that's trying to get technology to schools in San Mateo County. Our desired outcome is that every child in every school in San Mateo County has a computer on his desk by the year 2010. I mean, I'm not sure whether that's a sensible outcome or not, but someone could have it. You want something quite tangible where you can picture the future state. And we sometimes ask tough questions like, in order to say what the impact is you're looking to have, what impact, what would exist in the future? What would exist that would put you out of business? There are a lot of technology nonprofits we've worked with who are trying to provide technology services to nonprofits. And I heard someone say at one of them something like, well, we'd be out of business if nonprofits had equal access to technology as for-profits. Okay, say a little more. Which nonprofits? And we finally worked with them. It's hard work to get them pinned down. They were really talking about a certain size nonprofit. They were saying, small to medium-sized nonprofits serving underprivileged communities had equal access to technologies. Okay, and how would that manifest itself? And just trying to get it. People don't always clarify that. And then the next box in here, which is theory of change, was how does that occur? My best example of theory of change is lots of organizations work in education reform, school reform of some sort. And you can get 20 different theories of how to improve public schools in America. But most people will say that it's a very complex theory, that you need more trained teachers and more this and more standards, and the kids have to be well fed, and there have to be after-school programs. There may be a very complex theory of change. But then they may believe, well, wait a minute, there's 20 different things that influence school reform. The third box, program service, focus, which piece of that are you going to work on? So we spent a lot of time really pushing. We're instigators, we're nudging, we're cajoling the executive director, sometimes the executive director and their staff, sometimes with board members, sometimes with not, a real clarification around what is it you want to accomplish, what do you want to see accomplished in the world, what do you want your work to result in, how does that get done in general, and which pieces of that are you actually going to do, and which pieces are you leaving for other people? The sort of things you come across are someone says, we believe every kid needs a good breakfast in order to learn. And then you look at their budget, and they spend 80% of their money training teachers. And you say, your program focus is not aligned with the part of the theory of change that you're most espousing. You're espousing a theory of change that has a heavy emphasis on kids being well fed. Why are you training teachers? Why aren't you feeding kids? And believe it or not, people talk about mission creep. You can imagine how they got into the teacher training business, right? Because somebody was probably willing to give them a grant to do that or some other reason. So these just may be a useful way to think about that once you are able to think about the program focus. So let's suppose an organization, I'm going to pick on one of our clients, an organization called the Great Valley Center, just trying to do work in the entire Central Valley of California, a vast area. They can't do everything. They're well funded from some big California foundations. They have chosen specific programs to say, we're going to train more leaders in places like Modesto and Fresno and places that are part of the Central Valley, because the best and the brightest people from there don't always go home again. We want to train leaders and train people capable of running towns and districts, and it's led by a former mayor. So leadership training is one of the levers. Some of the things involved, they've been able to articulate, they're going to leave to other people. Little community center where my friend volunteered filling out job applications in Sonoma, they used to get people dropping clothes off on their doorstep because they knew that this was a place where, poor Latino people were coming who weren't yet assimilated into the community, and people would donate clothes. Well, there were lots of organizations taking clothes. They decided, we don't do clothes. The clothes goes to another organization. We'll keep a couple of suits in the closet here for people might need for a job interview, but we're not taking in secondhand clothing. We're not the Salvation Army or Goodwill or an association that collects used clothing. What about medical care? We're not about medical care. We're about job applications and English language training, whatever. And so when they picture in Sonoma a future outcome for those people, they don't picture used clothing being circulated. They picture a situation where people of Latino descent, people moving to Sonoma County, particularly actually the city of Sonoma, can have a sort of fair chance or better chance to get work and learn the language, period. Keep it at that level. When you sit around, you can imagine when you sit around with board members, you get lofty mission-like things like, Latinos entering the city of Sonoma will find an equal playing field, a level playing field, or, we will reach a point where the representation of the Latino community in local government will be equal to that of its proportion of the population. Well, those are probably pretty cool goals. They're pretty lofty. But this particular community center isn't doing that. It's not running elections for Latino candidates. It's trying to get new folks jobs. So it's real easy for the creep to occur. This way of thinking about it is the best starting point and simplest starting point we've come across. Then once you know what you're doing, so we're not doing clothing, we're doing this, you can actually look at what is it required to do the stuff. What are the operational requirements? What do we need to do the stuff we've said we're going to do, and how are we going to measure it? And then it ultimately loops back. Because if you measure it and you're failing, let's take my little center in Sonoma. Suppose nobody's getting a job and everyone's dropping out of the English language class after things. Well, they better go all the way back and relook at their theory of change and their attendance and say, what are we doing wrong? What's happening here? What's ineffective? Are we providing the right service? So there's always a feedback loop. It's not just a static process from left to right. I don't know if that will be helpful to you in your work, but it's one. It seems almost obvious that you need to start with what's the impact. It seems sort of like, what is it you're trying to accomplish? But it is amazing how fuzzy that can be. One of them that people often ask is about the scarcity of data. I'm going to let Maisie comment on that a little bit because obviously there isn't the same sort of data in the nonprofit sector. And then at Bridgespan, we've tried to take some of what I'll call the traditional Bain & Company consulting tools, and a couple of people commented on things like, how do you compare 12 different things, and give you at least a couple of tips as to how you might use data in a way similar to a for-profit.
Quickly, why is data scarce in the nonprofit sector? If you've worked with the nonprofit sector, you know the data is scarce. Different reasons for it are on the left-hand side of the page up here. Sometimes lack of time or interest, inadequate external pressure, weak systems. Systems is a really rampant problem in the sector. Turnover. And then there are incentives to hide data. There are incentives to hide costs because of the ratios that we spoke of earlier. So people will put salaries that actually are administrative or just for internal capacity building and allocate them to programs. So it's very difficult to get a real view of the organization in terms of costs and impact. What do you do as a consultant? One, you access whatever data you can, and everybody's Form 990 IRS form is on an organization's website called GuideStar. There is some public comparisons in magazines like Worth for comparables, and other organizations are starting to take this on. You leverage simple, straightforward quantitative analysis. If you do a fixed variable cost analysis for a nonprofit, that packs a lot of power. They generally don't think about those issues. One of the most credible pieces of analysis, and really Seth's going to go deep on this, is just a time analysis. Sit down with an ED. Where do you spend your time? And then go back to Seth's point earlier around what's your theory of change. Does your theory of change match where you spend your time? Very powerful. And it just helps people step back. And then use quantitative analysis, interviews with board members, being able to give that objective perspective of, I interviewed 7 board members, here are some themes and disguised quotes, this is what people are saying and thinking. I'm going to put up very briefly a qualitative analysis that I've used successfully with the United Way, and it's a moon chart. And basically, you can disguise moons, which are quantitative, 25%, 50%, 75%, but they're moons, so they're less threatening. And what this does is it addresses the issue of mission creep. It's a qualitative tool to address mission creep. When a particular organization, the United Way, had 35 programs I looked at, compares different programs against these dimensions, they're able to say, okay, these criteria are the most important, and X programs do not fit. And basically, to read the chart, it is a little difficult. If something has everything across the board, you got your brand, you can recover your cost, you're distinctive, you've got staff to do it, and it targets your population, but it's not aligned with your mission, the action you should take is to change the focus or get rid of it. And this is a tool that I've used in, the public example I can use is the United Way, several nonprofits, and it's very, very powerful. It's simple but powerful. If you've got everything across the board but you don't have distinctive competence, partner. Very simple. And what happens is quite often when you get into discussing an individual program, folks will say, but it's really great and it really helps the kids and so on and so forth, and you'll hear what often can be a rationalization. So this brings it down to brass tacks, and I would recommend using it with multiple constituents to basically get out different perspectives, and we've used it with volunteers and boards and staff as well.
Just to show how consulting practice has merged among firms. I mean, we have a chart somewhere that is very, very similar that we used with a client that was involved in 6 or 7 specific programs, and along the top were just the things they had said were most important. Similar analogies to things like, they didn't have a brand one, for example, but they had some other ones that were important to them, and basically just forcing them in some qualitative way to force rank them, or getting enough people that you kind of put up a straw man for. You sort of say, hey, we've interviewed 10 people, and here's what it appears the consensus. And people will argue and dicker over it a little bit, but it just gives them something to start to question whether a program is aligned with the strategy, whether something should be changed or eliminated. I'm going to give a couple of relatively quick examples. Maisie made reference to break-even analysis, fixed variable cost type analysis. These are things that are second nature to most business people. But one of the best, if someone presents you with a question in any way, shape, or form that they don't really know kind of how they're doing in a certain program, they sort of, I think you had up there something you called, revenue, sort of matching revenue and cost. There are lots of reasons to obfuscate data. Lots and lots of reasons to do it. There's an article outside I encourage you to read. It's also on our website called Costs Are Cool. The title came from a young analyst on our staff who said, when you start digging into the costs of an organization, business or nonprofit, all these nifty observations, all these insights bubble up. And so I encourage you to read it, not because costs really are so cool, but because they really are sometimes the gateway to a strategic decision. The example that is in there is a very common matrix that we certainly did not invent. Is a very simple matrix that some of you have seen before, where if this is mission on one side and this is financial on the other side, and this is low and high and low and high, it wouldn't be a good consulting presentation without a matrix. Basically, a lot of organizations in one form or another can help you think about whether a particular program or activity they're involved in is one of the most critical, one of the highest, or one of the lowest in terms of its fit with mission or its mission importance. On the financial side, if you can do an exercise, even rudimentarily, even by getting people to estimate their time or anything else, that starts to say where are the costs really being spent against a program, you can start to add this dimension. And it doesn't have to be meticulous to 2% accuracy. But what happens is, if you look at an organization with 4 programs, they may have told you going in, we do this thing out here because it generates a lot of money. It helps us fund what we really want to do over here. And we got this other thing here, which it actually generates a little bit of income because we're able to charge it. It's a work training program. We're able to charge corporations for their people, being trained, for the workplace. And we've got, one other program. We don't really, quite know where it is. But if you do the analysis, you find out, it's here. They might start out letting you believe that this one is funding this one. I had one client that, remember also, nonprofits, analytically, don't be fooled by the term income. Earned income is not income. Earned income is revenue. So when people refer to earned income, they say, well, this generates $1 million for us every year. We run these programs. We have income from the community, from wherever it is, $1 million over here. Or we run a membership program. We're the zoo. I mentioned it before. We get $1 million from our membership program. How much do you spend running the membership program? Don't know, right? Or, we only have 1 staff on it. Really? And when you just figure out how much time do different people spend on membership, or how much time do different people spend, we have one client, quite seriously, it's in the article. It's disguised in the article even more nicely than this. They had $1 million item. Their only earned income source was $1 million of revenue, and they were spending $960,000 a year to run it. They talked about it like $1 million, and it was really $40,000. Huge, huge difference. And all you're really doing is just taking kind of the business person's mind and saying, okay, of the costs of your $2 million budget or your $200,000 budget or whatever size organization it is, where's that money going against different programs? And of course, even identifying what are the programs, you may have some blurring, right? You may not, they may talk about 2 programs. Well, wait a minute. You're doing workshops for people for welfare to work. But the same workshops some people attend from corporations that you charge. Are those 2 different programs you want to assess, or 1 program? You trying to assess the economics of the workshop, or you'll have to think through where you want to break it down. But it may be that the corporate-funded workshops really are out here, and the welfare to work workshops are down here. They're not generating the financial, or they're up here. They're not generating the financial. They're what you really want to be doing. So it's an interesting construct. It's in that regard. It's one way to think, one thing to think about. The other thing we talked about, Maisie made reference to break even, and I started to talk about it and I changed my mind. Most people know the typical way, to think about a break even is that you have some fixed costs and then you've got something on top of it that's variable with each unit of it you do. Take my job training example. You've got a classroom, the electricity, you've got a teacher, and that's fixed. And then for each person who attends, you've got some supplies and you provide refreshments or something else, okay? And it grows, obviously, on a variable basis per person attending the class. And obviously the traditional break even, you're looking for how many units. If this is volume here and this is cost or revenue, this is dollars. You're all familiar with a break even concept. This is something that is so simple for most business people, but I produced one chart for an organization that rents out a facility. They happen to have a picture of a church basement, if you will, keep it simple, okay? That isn't what it was, but they have a facility they can rent, and it brings in extra earned income, okay? It brings in some revenue. They figured out, because they have to have somebody there when it's open, they have electricity, they figured out their fixed and variable costs. We had a relatively junior analyst just go through with them what it costs in a way they've never done before. It figured out that at 65% utilization, this room, this facility, if you used 65% of the available nights, okay, it would break even. Cover the cost of the janitor and the custodian and the security guard and so on. They happened to, fortunately, be operating at 72% capacity, but they were worried that with the economy it would shrink. They never knew what the break-even was before. And the difference between 72 and 65 in a tight economy, they could sink to the point where they'd be better off not opening the church basement to the public, not having it as a revenue source, than having it as a phantom income source. You follow? And that's a relatively simple analysis that everybody in this room is capable of doing, that nonprofits don't always have the time or the effort or the person to do. I'm just going to give one other quick example. There are lots of them that to think about when you hear about the problems in the group. And one is that with spreadsheets these days, a lot of people think of sort of scenario analysis, sort of doing a whole scenario of, well, if this happens, this happens, this happens. Because you're asked in a lot of these projects to do what people loosely think of as strategic planning, a lot of times you're being asked to think about the next 5 years. And people will, simply the fact that you show up with an Excel spreadsheet with 5 columns in it makes you foreign in the first place, right? So bear in mind that, first of all, just having the talent to help somebody lay out 5 years into the future with some set of assumptions, how many people will be served, how much staff will there be, what are our costs, what are our administration, whatever it happens to be. It can be the simplest model. It doesn't have to be an elaborate spreadsheet with lots of inputs and lots of macros and lots of graphics coming in and out. I handed one client literally a pro forma P&L with 8 line items in 5 years, and I'd worked with him for 6 months. We'd accomplished all sorts of things in terms of their strategic focus, their clarity. So that sheet of paper is all he remembers. Okay? Because he didn't have anyone on his staff who could even guesstimate, okay, wait a minute, if I have 100 people and it grows at 10% in terms of the people I'm serving, 110, 121, I mean, he just doesn't have people on his staff that think that way. So recognize that even in the simplest form, you're saying, hey, I can lay out this spreadsheet. I was on the board of a school that was trying to do a faculty. Any of you serve on boards of schools, your kids' schools, maybe people in here, your grandchildren's schools. I don't know. Anybody? We got some people. We were asked to look at faculty compensation. And I was the only person on the faculty compensation committee, there were faculty members, administrators, and so forth, who was comfortable just using a spreadsheet. And I basically had to take the data disguised of the 35 teachers at this school and what they were making and what the competitive salary was. Simple things that you would just do. Don't be afraid to let those be the cornerstone of your output. That school put in place a whole new structure based solely on what I fiddled with on an Excel spreadsheet. There was nobody else there to do it. Clearly, they had to, get a picture of people voted and kibitzed and did everything they had to do to kick it around, and they made it worse, of course, each time. But it was a very simple tool. It was 35 teachers just being shown under different scenarios of what if we were able to increase salaries this much, what if other schools increased this much, just showing it side by side. And I think that ability to think of a scenario in the future and vary one variable, take that example, what if the other schools in our community raise salaries 8%? Will we have caught up to them? What if they raised them 10%? Will we have caught up? The simple tools that a spreadsheet allows you to do are incredibly powerful in this sector. They are assumed in the for-profit sector. They are like gold dust in many cases in the nonprofit sector.
To close, when we think about the actual work of leaving the nonprofit, really thinking through the most appropriate way to remain involved. One piece during the actual engagement that we didn't mention is this is a tremendous opportunity for coaching. Them for you and you for them. And actually thinking about it that way is one of the hardest things, actually. I can get the consultants to drop the blue suits, but dropping there, I'm here to tell you what to do or to show you the path, and engaging in more of a coaching dynamic is one of the more difficult aspects. And then, actually having an implementation plan, clear measures and metrics, and some of the material we have has examples of that. And then being sensitive in terms of communicate. You can't over-communicate in the nonprofit sector is my fundamental philosophy. And then this piece, really determining how you're going to remain involved. Being on the board is a tremendously powerful way to stay involved with a nonprofit after you've done some work. Monthly cups of coffee, particularly if you enjoy, hanging out with the individual, is also very, very powerful. And then having the metrics, which Seth talked about earlier, where, quite often I'll go have that cup of coffee with a client and I'll bring the 3 horizons we spoke about earlier, or the 1 page of these are the metrics, how are you doing? Not in a confrontational, have you done my stuff way, but in a, just to revisit, this is the stuff we worked on,